Most High put together. We gon' see. In times.
Serpents lurking, watchers watching, Yasharala stay on point. They lurking. We under the covenant, we ain't got no other choice. Gird your loins up, armor up, cause it's time for war. We the generation that's gon' get on one accord. Serpents lurking, watchers watching, Yasharala stay on point. We under the covenant, we ain't got no other choice. Gird your loins up, armor up, cause it's time for war.
Muslims. Who did they learn the whole trade from?
Okay. So you claiming that the Christian Europeans learned how to conduct slavery from the Muslims.
I'm saying that the British, the Spanish, the Portuguese learned it from them.
This is a hard-hitting talk, but it's a talk that we are finding Muslims need to hear. There has been this perception around the world that slavery is uniquely a Christian problem, that slavery is uniquely a European, American, Western problem, that slavery has nothing to do with Islam. And especially in my country, in America, this is the only narrative you're going to hear. And it's bringing thousands upon thousands of young Afro-Americans to Islam. They're leaving the church in droves and becoming Muslims because of slavery. They're leaving the churches here in Britain, the Afro-Caribbeans, because of slavery. Islam has been involved in the slave trade for 1,400 years, 1,000 years longer than the Europeans. The slave trade was always in Africa, and it was always controlled by Muslims. And slavery is always Arabs enslaving Africans, never the other way around. It has always been black slavery. Now, this one I'm presenting today is not my work, okay? This is from a girl on our team, Sarah Foster. She and I got up on the ladder back in March of last year, and we actually filmed this on the ladder for the first time. 25,000 people have watched that film, just that one film already, and it's causing a huge furore.
We know that Christianity was in Africa from the 1st century. By the 4th century, Christianity was the state religion of Ethiopia. We know it's the state religion of Nubia. We know that there was a strong hold of Christianity in Africa. What happened in the 7th century? Islam. What happened in the 8th century?
What happened?
Expansion into Africa, expansion into Europe. Nubia was a Christian country, and Muslims kept attacking them and attacking them. And then they said, okay, we will not attack you if you send over 300 and so slaves every single year. We don't see Christians enslaving people in Africa. 1st century, 4th century, all the way up to the 15th century. What happened before that? We see Islam from the 7th century all the way up until the 20th century in
the 21st century. It still exists today.
Jesus never had any slaves. Did his disciples take slaves? No.
So what happened prior to the transatlantic slave trade, which began in 1400 AD? Take a look at the timeline there. You see 1407 over there on the right. Look at all these names. I just want you to look at these names. These are household names. Al-Jahiz, Ibn Qutayba, Al-Tabari. They're from the 9th up until the 10th century. Al-Muqaddasi in the 10th century. Ibn Sina in the 11th century. Jumping up to Nasr al-Din al-Tusi in the 13th century. Ibn Taymiyyah, the 14th century. And Ibn Khaldun in the late 14th century. Take a look at these names. These may not be familiar to you coming from the West, but any Muslim will know these names. These would be the John Calvins. These would be the Luthers. These would be the great men of God, the Augustines of the Muslim world. These are the ones that every Muslim follows. What we're going to do is look at how they look and see what they said about black people, about Africans. All of this is before the European slave trade. So this predates long before Europeans got into this. Look at Al-Jahiz, 9th century. We know that the Zanj, that's the name in Arabic for blacks, are the least intelligent and the least discerning of mankind, and the least capable of understanding the consequences of actions. Al-Jahiz goes on to say, like the crow among mankind are the Zanj, African blacks, for they are the worst of men and most vicious of creatures in character, in temperament. Al-Jahizm also says, they, the Shu'ubiyah, which is a group amongst the Zanj, maintain that eloquence is prized by all people at that time. Even the Zanj, which are the black Africans, despite their dimness, their boundless stupidity, their obtuseness, their crude perceptions, and their evil dispositions, make long speeches. Blacks are ugly and misshapen because they live in a hot country, according to Ibn Qutayba in the 9th century. Al-Muqaddasi, writing in the 10th and 11th century, of the neighbors of the Buja, Muqdasi had heard that there is no marriage among them, and the child does not know his father, and they eat people, but God knows best. As for the Zanj, they are the people of black color, flat noses, kinky hair, and little understanding or intelligence. Ibn Sam, household name. Everybody knows this name. In the 10th and 11th century, blacks are people who are by the very nature slaves. Nasr al-Din al-Tusi, writing in the 13th century, if all types of men are taken from the first and one placed after another, like the Negro from Zanzibar in the southernmost country, the Negro does not differ from an animal in anything except the fact that his hands have been lifted from the earth, in no other peculiarity or property, except for what God wished. Many have seen that the ape is more capable of being trained than the Negro and more intelligent. Can you imagine repeating this today? They've got to go back and see how people who are the greatest thinkers of Islam, this is what they thought of Afro-Americans, of Africans. Ibn Khaldun, listen, Khaldun, you all know this name. Highly prized amongst Muslims. Therefore, the Negro nation are as a rule submissive to slavery because Negroes have little that is essentially human and have attributes that are quite similar to those of dumb animals, as we have stated. Beyond known peoples of black West Africa, to the south there is no civilization in the proper sense. There are only humans who are closer to dumb animals than to rational beings. They live in thickets and caves and eat herbs and unprepared grain. They frequently eat each other. They cannot be considered human beings. I mean, to me, it's just absolutely heinous to read this kind of stuff. And yet this comes from the greatest thinkers of Islam. Take a look and see where the timeline is, just to remind you what we're talking about. Edward William Lane on Egyptian slavery, he talks about Egyptian slavery, and he says the price of a white slave girl is usually from the treble to tenfold that of an Abyssinian, and the price of a black girl about half or 2/3, or considerably more if well instructed in the art of cookery. The black slaves are generally employed as menials. So looking and understanding when they're in Egypt, he could see this differentiation. Yet from 639, we have the Arab conquest into Africa, and there is very little evidence of slave raids in Africa before the Muslim involvement. An Ashanti ruler stated, which is interesting, this predates the Muslim coming into Africa, I cannot make war to catch slaves in the bush like a thief. My ancestors never did so. Suggesting that this was not something that was done before Islam. In 652, the penetration of Islam, we find an agreement made between Muslim Egypt and Christian Nubia requiring Nubia to supply 360 slaves annually to Egypt. In addition to 360, another 40 were sent annually, either for the Arab officials handling the transaction to compensate for an estimated 10% loss during the transport. It looks like this whole idea of slavery was introduced then in the 650s, or roughly from about 20 years after Muhammad, going up to Egypt. David Bryan Davis comments that by the 8th and 9th century, Arab writers were then writing, increasingly invoked the biblical curse of Canaan to explain why the sons of Ham had been blackened and degraded to the status of natural slaves as punishment for their ancestors' sin. Goldenberg says Lewis did not find any anti-black sentiment in Arabia until the 7th century conquest of Africa and the enslavement of its inhabitants. We need to say, you've got to deal with Islamic slave trade. It is much greater than anything that happened in the transatlantic, and it is only the transatlantic slave trade that was stopped. You don't find any of that. There is no abolition. I've asked many Muslims, can you show me one abolition movement of abolition of slavery? There is none. We just can't find any in 1400 years. It doesn't exist. From 1807 to 1815, Europeans eradicated slavery. Saudi Arabia did not eradicate it until 1960. Mauritania in 1981. That was under duress of the United Nations. The USA has had a war against slavery. There is no war in Islam to eradicate slavery. European countries have admitted and apologized for the slavery. Muslim nations have never apologized, even recognized that they had slaves. Slavery does not exist today in the West. Only Muslim countries still enslave. This was done by Baroness Cox. I don't even know, from here in London. She went down to Sudan, she went to Mali, and she bought slaves on camera to show that they still exist today. She filmed it, and then she freed them on camera to show that it still exists today and only in Muslim countries. Caused a huge furore when she did that. Black people choose their name, whereas today in Islam, the name for black people is Abid. That is a name for slave. That Abid means slave. Even the name in Arabic for a black person is slave. It's imbued even into the language. Conclusion, Galatians 5:1. For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Folks, we need to get this out into the public sphere. We need to have especially Afro-Americans and Afro-Caribbeans to hear this, because there is a hemorrhaging happening within the Afro-Caribbean churches and the Afro-American churches, because they don't know how to deal with their slave past. When in reality, Islam is coming and saying, come on to us, because we don't have a problem with slavery. Yet Islam has an enormous problem with slavery, which they have yet to recognize. When you look at the historical environment, when you look at the manuscripts, when you look at the Quran, when you look at the traditions, when you look at these great men of Islam and look and see what they felt about black people, when you quote them verbatim, Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Sina, Ibn Taymiyyah, these are household names. Muslims need to deal with their slave problem, and they need to come back to Jesus Christ.
Other renowned medieval Muslim thinkers, such as the Spanish Said al-Andalusi, 1029 to 1070, wrote that blacks are more like animals than men, and that the rule of virtue and stability of judgment is lacking among them, with foolishness and ignorance general among them. Blacks, according to al-Andalusi, have never made use of their minds in seeking after wisdom, nor exercised themselves in the study of philosophy. Others, such as Ibn Sina, 980 to 1037, similarly depict blacks as inherently inferior and destined to be enslaved by the rest of mankind. To Ibn Sina, blacks are people who are by their very nature slaves. As far as Nazir al-Din Tusi, 1201 to 1274, a famous Iranian philosopher, was concerned, if various kinds of men are taken, and one placed after another, like the Negro from Zanzibar in the southmost countries, the Negro does not differ from an animal in anything except the fact that his hands have been lifted from the earth, except for what God wishes. Many have seen that the ape is more capable of being trained than the Negro, and more intelligent. Ibn Khaldun, 1332 to 1406, on his part, wrote that blacks are only humans who are closer to dumb animals than to rational beings. The reason for their characteristic levity, excitability, and great emotionalism, according to Ibn Khaldun, is due to the expansion and diffusion of the animal spirit in them. They are therefore remote from those of human beings and close to those of wild animals. Blacks are ignorant of all religion and cannot be considered human beings. Therefore, the Negro nations are, as a rule, submissive to slavery because Negroes have little that is essentially human. A large number of East African slaves, the Zanj, were employed in their thousands on the sugar plantations of Khuzestan and saltpeter mines of the Abbasid Caliphate, located on the Euphrates, as early as the 8th century. Apparently due to the harsh conditions to which they were subjected, they rose in numerous revolts, and between 868 and 883, their rebellion became a real threat to the Abbasid Caliphate. The hunting, kidnapping, purchase and traffic of Africans into servitude went on throughout the centuries but increased greatly in the 19th century after Said ibn Sultan, ruler of Muscat, in 1832, moved to Zanzibar and established plantation farming. Here, Arab and Swahili Muslim slave traders took advantage of prevailing internecine conflicts and cashed in on the captives of war with stronger African tribes such as the Yao, Nyamwezi, and Ganda, acting as crucial intermediaries and accomplices. Men like Tipu Tib and Rumaliza organized well-armed gangs of slave raiders in the interior with the sole aim of raiding smaller indigenous communities whom they could then march, both as commodities themselves and as porters of ivory to the coast for sale.
In his hand, destruction gotta come, that's how he get us out this lane. The devil working hard, trying to get us out his plane. His sheep hear his voice, so he can't get us out his hand. We gon' trust the Son of Man, blow your wings, Father. Your kingdom coming, we just trying to make it in, Father. Rather we